Hello guys, welcome to today's screencast, the first one in a series on the cardiovascular system. So what I'm going to do first up is just to give you kind of an idea of the big picture with regard to where we're going in the next week or so of lessons. So if we have a look onto here, what you've got, key things we're going to have to do. Now the first bubble here on the big picture, this is considered assumed knowledge. So obviously the topic is the cardiovascular system. We're looking at the heart, and particularly from GCSE PE or GCSE biology, you're expected to already have some understanding of the structure and the function of the heart. Okay, so for example, what chambers does the heart consist of? Now, I'm going to take you through two basic slides on this, which I'll talk about in a second. It can't be asked in an exam, but it is vital for you to be able to move on to the next two areas here. So the screencast is going to focus on the cardiac cycle tonight, and then down to here we've got the conduction system, which we're going to do in the lesson. And then as we move on from there, we're going to have a look at the relationship between heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. I'm sure people will have some kind of knowledge of this from GCSE PE. Then we're going to have a look at how the relationship between these changes during exercise or physical activity. Okay, finally we're going to have a look at the different ways that the heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output could be regulated when we take part in physical activity. So that's the big picture. That's where we're going over the next week. So what I'm going to do now, let's just move on to the bit I said. So the thing we're focusing on is going to be the cardiac cycle in the screencast. If you have a look at the specification, what you're required to know, you're required to know that the cardiac cycle has two stages. The first one is called diastole, second one is systole. Now, it's absolutely vital that at the end of this screencast, you have good notes for this section. Okay, this is the most important section. It's the bit you're going to be examined on, so you must make sure you have notes. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in the lesson, we're going to cover this and how the conduction system, or the impulse of the heart, links to the cardiac cycle. I'm going to give some optional note-taking responsibility here, because the assumed knowledge, as I said earlier, was structure and function of the heart and pathway of blood. If you did this at GCSE PE and felt particularly confident with it, you do not need to make detailed notes, but there are certain tasks I'm going to ask you to do. One task off each of the next slides, just to make sure you have some kind of knowledge on how blood travels through the heart to the lungs and to the body. Okay, so let's have a look then. First bit, structure of the heart. So again, optional notes if you want to make them. What is not optional is the task I give you. So if this is the structure of the heart, there's lots of stuff on here you don't really need. However, there are certain things that are absolutely vital for the lesson we're going to do. It's really important that you have an understanding of the four chambers of the heart. So you've got the right atrium here, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Now, at first glance, if this is brand new to you, it shouldn't be, but if it is brand new to you, so you might look at this heart diagram and say, well, hang on, that's on the right. What you've got to imagine is you're behind it and it's your heart. Okay, it's your heart, so that will be the left atrium there. Right atrium, top two chambers are called the atrium. When they're put together, they're called the atria. Okay, so then we go down into here. There are two valves here. So you've got something called the mitral valve, or it can also be called the bicuspid valve that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. And then when you've got your right atrium here coming down to the right ventricle, there's a valve that separates and prevents blood from backflowing called the tricuspid valve. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, the only task I really give you here is just to make sure that you have, using a box diagram for the heart, very simple. Can we look at that? If that's the right atrium, left atrium, using this as our heart, this bit in here can be used as your valves. All I'm asking you to do, can you just make sure you've got into these boxes the following key terms. So when you come into lesson, I expect to see in your notes a box, four boxes like this, okay, into one box. That is to demonstrate the heart, so that could quite easily just be moved over to a box here. Okay, if you could use this line, obviously would be the septum, which is not labelled on there, I don't think. But what I need you to do is make sure you've got the right ones in the right place there. These can be the valves, just loose valves there. Okay, that's it. That's easy to start off with. Let's have a look then at the pathway of blood through the heart. So pathway of blood through the heart then, if I look over to here, now basically the heart works as a double pump. So I'm going to take you through kind of one side of the kind of circulatory system or the cardiovascular system at a time. We're going to have a look at how blood travels through there. Again, you don't need to make notes on this. I'm just going to take you through for those people who have no idea. If we start then at the lungs, we're going to go down the left side. So if you imagine now you breathe in oxygen, okay, and oxygen through a process called gaseous exchange will then diffuse into the blood. Okay, so if we imagine now, we'll go around this section. Now, when it comes down here, we come down, the blood travels through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. The left atrium will then pass the blood through the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve down into the left ventricle. It will then make a loop up round here, come round through the aorta into our working muscles. At this point, we use the oxygenated blood that we got from the lungs that's come down the left side and take it to our working muscles, and it allows us to perform. So that is the left side of the heart. Now, if you have a look onto this, now the left side function, if you could just make a quick note of this, it's really important. Structurally, the heart chambers, both the atria and particularly the ventricles, are thicker. The walls are thicker, and the reason is it's really urgent that we get this oxygenated blood to our working muscles. So the blood travels faster, the vessels are the blood travels under higher pressure, and it will get down here to the working muscles. So the left side of the heart function is to take oxygenated blood to the working muscles, which is absolutely vital. Now, once we've got oxygen, so the red is to symbolise oxygenated blood into our working muscles. That means there's very little oxygen left in it, so the blood becomes deoxygenated, so it turns blue. Again, not needed for you at A-level standard. So when you get down to here, the deoxygenated blood then comes back through the right side. So it's going to come into here, so it comes up into here, comes into the right atrium. Okay, that then passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and this is then, it goes out through the pulmonary artery back to the lungs. We breathe that out, get more oxygen in, and then it carries on again. Okay, so that is the process that would happen. So the right side of the heart function is to remove the deoxygenated blood via gaseous exchange, breathing out via the lungs. Okay, so that is our focus there. For those people, we will look at some videos to show how this works in action, but for now, that's the pathway of blood through the heart. Again, what's not on here are the chambers, which are massively important for us. But for those people who just want to see an overview of why our heart beats, okay, where the blood is travelling, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated, that is it. Okay, I will not be recapping any of this, okay, in the lesson. Our focus is going to be narrowed in, really narrowed in to the atria and the ventricles. That's our focus, but an idea of this is helpful. Okay, so focus. Note taking now has to be on point. You must make sure you're focused and you get it into your Cornell notes and you have questions to kind of interrogate the notes you're using. So, cardiac cycle then. What is it? This kind of refers to the cardiac muscle contraction, and it basically is specifically focused on the movement of blood through its chambers. And the chambers, as we know, are the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle, so the atria and ventricles. Now, one complete cardiac cycle would represent the kind of events or the sequence of events that take place in a heartbeat. So the key thing is that we're looking here that when our heart fills up, it's called diastole, which is phase 1. And then phase 2, we have to have a look at two different bits within this. It's called systole, when the blood is contracts, or the blood is moved, or it empties from the heart. So to make that a little bit more simplistic, diastole then, okay, it's the relaxation phase of the cardiac muscle, and this is where the chambers, the atria and ventricles, fill up with blood after it's been out around the body into the lungs. So this is when you fill the atria and ventricles with blood. So that's the key thing for diastole. Let's have a look from there. Once you filled the heart up, we then need to contract the heart in order to empty the blood out around the body into the lungs. So this bit here, systole, is the contraction phase of the cardiac muscle, where the blood is forcibly emptied around the body, okay, and to the lungs. And it consists of two key phases, and this is really important now. So as we've seen before from our knowledge of the pathway of blood around the heart, the blood always hits the atria first, okay, and then it's passed down to the ventricles. So it always goes alphabetically, you could say, A first, V second. So if we have a look at this, we've got it atriosystole. So atriosystole, this is when the atria, the walls of the atria contract and force the blood into the ventricles. Once that happens, it will go through the valves. We talked about bicuspid and tricuspid valves, and then from that, we then get all the blood into the ventricles, which causes the ventricular systole. And this is when the ventricles contract and force the blood around the body. Okay, so this is the bit to answer the lungs, of course. So we're getting the blood out now. So it's kind of the ventricle walls contract. We get it out to the working muscles. We also get it back to the lungs to get oxygenated again. So it's really, really important that we get these things down. So we've got this cardiac, this stuff here, the cardiac cycle, the generic stuff is just to get your knowledge. But ultimately, in the exam, when a question comes up on the cardiac cycle, it's asking you about the filling phase, the relaxation and filling phase, which is diastole, and then it's asking you about systole, which is the contraction and emptying phase of the heart, which is split into two: top chambers first, bottom chambers second. Without the top chambers, you can't get the blood to the bottom chambers, and then without the bottom chambers, you can't get the blood out and around to the body and to the lungs, to the working muscles. So that's our key focus then. What I'm going to ask you to do is, your notes need to be good on that. I'm just going to give you a quick visual of this in action. So if we have a look onto here, don't worry about the valve stuff. I'm not a big believer in how important that is. So what I'm just going to ask you to look at here, if you look at stage one then. Okay, stage one, if you look at the heart here, is diastole. Okay, so you look here, and it comes back into there. You've got it, look here, the arrow's coming into here, and it's basically all of this is kind of looking at the blood, so the atria relaxing and all the blood filling up into the atria and then slightly into the ventricles, as you can see here. Okay, so that is the first bit there. So stage one is diastole. Why? Because the heart is relaxing and filling up with blood. Okay, that's what we would have into that section. So then we get to stage two, which is atriosystole. Now, as you can see here, the atria and this point and there, so you've got the right atrium and the left atrium, those two now have contracted and forced all of the blood into the ventricles. So it's atriosystole because the atria have contracted and forced the blood into the ventricles. Now the final bit, of course, is when we get the blood down to the ventricles here. So what happens at this point is now it's come down to here, we're looking at this idea of ventricular systole, okay, which is when the ventricles contract and force the blood out of the heart, which will go to the body, to the working muscles, and it will also go to the lungs. Okay, so that is the final bit. We get it out to the working muscles and the lungs. Working muscles so that we can perform, and the lungs so we can get rid of the deoxygenated blood and then get some more oxygenated blood back in. So that's the kind of focus. That's the order. If an exam question comes up on this, on the cardiac cycle, stage one, we've got diastole here. Why? Then we need to know stage two is atriosystole. Why? What do the atria walls do? And then finally we've got ventricular systole. Why is it this? Why is it called this? Well, the ventricles contract, systole contract, empty the blood where? And then we've got our section sorted. So that's what we need to have in. It's really important you have this in. I imagine this would be the questions. What does diastole mean? You know, particularly. So remember, we have to talk about that, and then also same for these bits. So make these into kind of more, I suppose, smaller questions. Okay, so you might need a little bit more at the moment, so make sure you come in with good knowledge at this. In lesson, we're going to have a real focus on making sure we have an understanding. If this is the cardiac cycle, for example, the filling of the heart, atria, diastole, ventricular diastole. Secondly, we look at atriosystole, ventricular systole, the contracting and emptying of blood. How does it happen? So the actual lesson focus, after we've recapped this, we'll be looking at how a specific impulse called the conduction system allows us to actually do this. It actually causes the heart to contract. So that's what we'll be looking at in the lesson, on top of what you've done on the screencast. Okay, thanks very much.